Some months ago I said at one of these meetings, has anyone heard of Sir Hubert Wilkins? And only about 3 hands went up. And I thought to myself, really, we must know or must learn something about this man. And so this is what I'm going to be discussing today. He deserves a big chapter in the Australian history book. And I think every school child should learn something about this man. On the surface, he was a photographer, a war correspondent and a polar explorer. But he became an expert in a number of fields: author, balloonist, war hero, naturalist, geographer, climatologist, navigator, etc., and a secret agent. An expert in every one of those fields. So a bit of background, he came from a rural property, family property near Hallett, about 100 miles north of Adelaide, and by the help of Dick Smith and the Australian Geographic, the family house has been restored, and it's now a historic site and an attraction for tourists. It has been improved since that photo was taken. The grounds have been improved. The family and he moved to Adelaide at the age of 16. He enrolled at the University of Adelaide in music, and he also enrolled in the School of Mines. He took special interest in electricity, electric motors and internal combustion engines. There was a travelling cinema that ended up near him at some stage, and they were having problems. And the travelling cinema, called a tent cinema, I don't think we ever had them in Western Australia, or they weren't called that. But they had a stationary motor driving a generator which drove the projector, and they were having problems. So this young 16-year-old went over and said, well, I think I can give you a bit of a hand there. So he sorted out the engine, sorted out the generator, got the projector working, and they said, well, we've got a job here for you if you want it. And he said, well, yeah, I'll work for you. So he stayed with that group for nearly 18 months. He directed his energies towards photography. He felt that that would hold a future for him. Later he moved to Sydney and got a job with the Gaumont film company. They were also impressed with him, his knowledge of photography, his application, and they said, we reckon that if ever you go to England, you'd always get a job at the head office of Gaumont. So he returned to South Australia and prepared to go to England, discovered he didn't have any money, and thought that the best way to get there would be to stow away. So he jumped on a ship and off he went. The captain discovered, or the crew discovered him, and the captain was very disappointed in him, and they finally worked out that he could do a job. They had an electric motor, an armature that needed rewinding. So they put him to work rewinding the armature in this electric motor, the field of expertise which he'd developed. But when he got to the end of the job, they said, well, you're off at the next port. So off he got. And so at the age of 16, 17, maybe 18 by this stage, he was befriended by an Italian gun runner. And I think the Italians had fingers in all of North Africa doing silly things. And they were also involved in spying and kidnapping and so on. So he ended up in a nest of people that weren't very nice. He was lured further and further inland, and the only way he could get out was with some advice from someone, and he ended up hiding in a roll of carpet that was put onto a camel, and the camel took off for a couple of days and got him to Tunisia. He then contacted the British consul, and he was assisted to London, and he got there for his 21st birthday. So as a young lad, he'd had a pretty good exposure to the basics of life. He started work with the Gaumont Film Company and also took on a job with the Daily Chronicle as a reporter. Both were impressed with what he could do. Just happened to go out to Hendon and strike up a conversation with a man called Claude Graham White, and it turned out that Graham White had just won the $10,000 prize for the Daily Mail race, and they went flying. So he got pretty interested in flying. He'd already been interested, but this whetted his appetite a little bit more. He then decided that what he should do is apply his photographic skills to flying. So he moved into the idea of still and movie photographs from the air. And so he befriended a person with an aircraft, and the only way he could get his photographs and movies from this was to lie astride or in front of the pilot, hanging onto those uprights and wires, and of course his camera caused a bit of a problem because it was hand wound. So in a precarious position, he took what were regarded as some of the best and earliest movie films. Gaumont then decided that they needed to cover the war in the Balkans, and he was given the job of going there and looking at the war from the point of view of the Turks. This was the first big war since the Franco-Prussian War in 1870, and a lot of people were interested in it. The Germans were giving a hand to the Turks, supplying equipment and personnel. The British and French were helping the Bulgarians, and Wilkins was given the job of looking at it from the point of view of the Turks. He got himself into some very precarious positions. He wanted to be at the front. He wanted to get photographs of the action of the Turks firing shots and how they were handling the war. The Turks had never seen anyone perform like this, and they thought, well, this bloke's got to be a spy. You know, why does he want to get so close? And he's sending reports back to London, and therefore he's going to be a problem to us. So he was regarded as a spy, and he nearly got shot. He talked his way out of it. One of his friends who accompanied him was the daughter of Mr. Citron from France. Laurette Citron accompanied him on that journey. When he got back to London, he was directed by Gaumont to go and photograph a balloon launch. The balloon was owned by two Australians, Spencer Brothers. When they got to the site for the launch, it was a bit windier than expected. The balloon was being buffeted around, and they said, we need a bit of extra weight on board here so that we can stabilise things. So Wilkins said, well, I'll go. So Frank Spencer, it's Captain Penfolds, who was representing a chocolate factory or a chocolate company, was going to parachute out of the balloon and deliver chocolates to children on the ground. It was going to be a big advertising campaign. Well, being a windier day than anticipated and they expected, and with Wilkins on board, they released the balloon and it fouled the ironwork of the gasworks. They were lucky not to be thrown out. The balloon eventually was freed and it took off, but it damaged the spill valve, so they couldn't release any of the gas. So their only mechanism to control the balloon was the bags of sand they had on board. If you release the gas, you'd come down, and they couldn't do that. And if you release the weight, you went up. Captain Penfold wasn't very happy with this, and at the first gap in the clouds, he dived out with his parachute. He was gone. This lightened the load of the balloon, and up it went. So they, without control, ended up at 15,000 feet. This all happened on the 23rd of December, and you can imagine in the Northern Hemisphere, that's a pretty cool area. They stayed up overnight because they had no way of coming down. And then when the gas in the balloon started to cool and reduce in size, the balloon started to come down, and this was happening overnight the next day. But it came down over the English Channel, and you can imagine what the channel was like in those days, in that time of year. You had about 3 minutes if you ended up in the water there before you'd fade out. So all the sand went, including the cameras, the movie camera, the still camera. They eventually blew back over the land and had a very rough landing on Christmas Eve, 1913. But it didn't put him off dealing with aircraft and vehicles and taking photographs. After the Wilkins assignment, he was given the job of going through the images from Scott and Shackleton, and this whetted his appetite for a visit to the Arctic or Antarctic. And so he was offered a job. He made it known that he wanted to go, and he was offered a job with Stephenson, who was a Canadian scientific explorer. So he met up with Stephenson in British Columbia, and then they headed off up into the wilds of Alaska and Canada. And that's the sort of track that they covered over 2 years. You can see that they were only in one small area. He was a born organiser. He copied what he could from the Eskimos and lived like an Eskimo. In fact, you could almost not kill him. He picked up all the tricks to survive. He saved Stephenson's life and became second in command of the expedition. That's him showing movies to the Eskimos in Christmas 1913. And he covered about 5,000 kilometres over the 2 years through the snow and ice. And in 1915, early 1915, he learnt from a trapper that World War I had started. He thought, well, I'd better get out of here and go and give a bit of a hand. So he headed south to civilization and eventually got back to Australia, where he joined the military forces, was given the rank of lieutenant, and he was engaged as a photographer. His immediate boss was Frank Hurley, who was a photographer of note in Australia and who'd been mixing with Mawson and Shackleton in their Antarctic exhibitions. So Wilkins was sent back to England, and then the Australians had him working as a photographer at the front line. He worked in the trenches, he worked at the front line, he put himself in danger. These are two of his photographs, and that's by someone else. And he was awarded the Military Cross for his efforts to rescue wounded soldiers at the Third Battle of Ypres. He produced some of the greatest war images, but later on they got a bit mixed up and no one quite knows which ones he took and what were taken by other people. But he certainly was involved in some great photography. He was awarded a bar for his military cross when he helped some American soldiers who were under threat. their officers had been killed in action, so he said, well, listen, gentlemen, this is the way you get out of this. So he took them to safety. Oh, didn't expect that to happen. And General Monash, who was highly regarded, said that he was the bravest man he'd ever seen or met. After the war, he organised a display in Australia of images of Australian forces in action, and led to a pictorial production of Australian war photographs. Prime Minister Hughes, in some of his speeches, reckoned this man had gone over the top, as he had with the troops, to get the photography. He took command of the photographic section of the Australian War Records, and he accompanied Charles Bean, a name that crops up in the Australian history books, as they went to Gallipoli to retrace the path of the Australian troops. In 1919, he took part in the England to Australia air race. He flew in the Blackburn Kangaroo as navigator. The nominated navigator was regarded by the organising committee to not be sufficiently qualified. Happened to be a bloke by the name of Charles Kingsford Smith. So he took over the position as navigator, but the aircraft crashed. It was engine failure. There it is, crashed in Crete. There's the map. Hounslow is where they left from. They had engine problems over France, where the first dot is, and they crashed in Crete without getting anywhere near Melbourne. He served as second in command for John Cope's Antarctic expedition of 1920. The expedition was badly organised, badly manned and understaffed, and it really didn't get off the ground. Wilkins had proposed that they use ex-World War I aircraft because he'd had enough experience in the ice and snow to know that an aircraft could achieve in an hour or two what was taking him a week or two on the ground. However, since the show was so badly organised, underfunded, undermanned, it didn't really happen, and he didn't get a chance to get the aircraft there. He served as Chief Scientific Officer in the Shackleton expedition of 1921-22, but unfortunately Shackleton passed away. Pat, is that your photograph? Yeah. Yes. So we've got that photograph from Patricia down the back there, who went on a trip to Antarctica. So you were mixing it with some of the best. Shackleton passed away before the expedition got going, but Wilkins carried on with useful research. He was then given an assignment through Gormont by the Society of Friends, and this was to travel through Russia, Czechoslovakia, Germany, Poland, and evaluate the damage and problems caused by the revolution, the Russian Revolution, and World War I. It was an assignment which required a man of his calibre. So that was what he reported on, and he also was engaged by the US government on a fact-finding mission at the same time. And so his expertise in all these various areas were being recognised around the world, both in Europe, across Europe, and in America and Canada. While he was returning home from that expedition, he received a cable to say, money's been approved for your exploration of Australia. He said, what's happening here? And when he got back to London, he went to the British Museum and they said, well, you said that you would go to Australia and collect specimens for us. We don't have a lot of specimens in Australia. So he came to Australia for 2 years and collected specimens of flora, fauna, insects, lived with Aborigines for 2 years and wrote up how they lived, etc. So that's him in the outback. And of course, he was pretty good at writing, so with most of these episodes he wrote a book. So between times, he was always working away. The Detroit Aviation Society and the Detroit newspaper, commonly called the Detroiter, engaged him to carry out an Arctic exploration. And so Wilkins says that he contacted his friend Anthony Fokker and arranged for 2 aircraft to be provided. I think they paid for them, but they got them at a pretty good price. So there was a single-engined Fokker and a 3-engine Fokker. That was in starting the Alaskan after they'd assembled it. Wilkins had teed up with an American pilot who was pretty good for the time, Eilerson. And Eilerson was flying this aircraft, and that was it a few minutes later. And so they got the Detroiter going, and that was it the next day. I'm not quite sure whether any of you are familiar with the term a black hole. Imagine if you're taking off on a runway at night. You've got runway lights, you've got them flashing past you, and if the circumstances were like what I'm going to describe, you take off and there's no horizon. There's no roads, no lights, no farmhouses, nothing out there apart from blackness. No moon, no clouds, just black out of the window. This means you've got to adopt a technique which relies totally on instruments. The same sort of thing can happen in reverse with a whiteout flying into a white hole. If you've got mist and fog in the distance, you've got white snow on either side of you, and you don't have the perspective of a runway, and pilots do rely on the perspective of a runway very, very much, but if your landing path is going to be just a little narrow arrangement as wide as your undercarriage going over bumpy ground, there's no perspective in that, and therefore you lose track of what's going on. So even flying on instruments doesn't do you a lot of good, and you can make mistakes. Well, these pilots at this early stage of aviation were sucked into the white hole and wrecked 2 aircraft. They learnt a lot from it, but it wrecked the aircraft. So while those aircraft were being repaired, he decided that he'd move into some Stinson biplanes. They really didn't fill the role that well. But it did allow him to get further and further into the polar regions. But eventually, the single-engine Fokker, known as the Alaskan, ended up being a write-off. They resurrected the 3-engine Fokker and managed to sail to a bloke who he'd met before, a bloke by the name of Charles Kingsford Smith. And Smithy used that aircraft to fly the the Pacific. Wilkins came across the Lockheed Vega. He was impressed by it. It was in its early days of development, but he was impressed by it and he purchased 2 of them. And he used those pretty much from then on with his Arctic and Antarctic research. In the Arctic, he carried out an experimental 2,000-mile survey. You appreciate that magnetic compasses aren't much good up there, so with sextant, etc. He navigated through the region, became familiar with how to handle the situation, spent a lot of time on the North Polar Cap, and then decided that what he should do is fly over the North Polar Cap. So there's the aircraft, the Lockheed, that's him and Eielson, preparing for their flight. And they flew from Barrow in Alaska through to Spitsbergen, island chain owned by Norway. It wasn't an easy flight. They hadn't gone far when they had to land in a snowstorm. They spent an overnight in the aircraft. They took off and didn't go much further again and had to land and spent 5 days in the aircraft while the storm blew over. They then finished the flight, a total of 20 hours and 2,500 miles. So he really was the first to transit the Arctic Ocean, or the area around the North Pole. The awards after that were the Royal Geographical Society, the American Geographical Society, and a knighthood from the King of England. He was requested to attend in the company of kings and queens throughout Europe. They were all very happy to have him along as their guest. And he wrote a book, another book. Randolph Hearst advanced him $25,000 for exploration, and this is what he got involved in towards the end of 1928. Still using the 2 Lockheed Vegas, they used wheels and floats and skis in their Antarctic exploration. So he's given away the northern climbs and he's back down south. So off the tip of South America, he explored the area in red there. And between seasons he was given an unusual assignment. He really had an assignment every year, trying to fill up his notebook with assignments. And that was to fly around the world in the Graf Zeppelin. People were actually paying him to do this. And so to be involved in this, he had to fly from Friedrichshafen to Lakehurst in America, in the airship, and then around the world. That's him on the flight deck, if you can call it that, with Dr. Hugo Egner, and he was the designer of the ship. There's the track that they follow, and over on the far side from me are the distances and times for the flight. Just quickly working through those, if you added up the hours, nearly 300 hours of flight time. The day after he got back from that, he married Susan Bennett. That was her stage name, an Australian actress. She was a very nice lady, as far as I can gather. She wrote the last chapter of his book, and in that you can see that she was a lovely person with a good sense of humour as well. Very understanding of him. And so, filling up the book with assignments, off to Antarctica again. The snow and ice had receded quite a lot, maybe they had some global warming in those days, and he had to use the Vega on floats. Eilson, his pilot, was with him throughout, and I'm sure that Wilkins was as good a pilot as Eilson. Incidentally, Wilkins didn't, while he became an expert in many areas, was never very qualified. He didn't sit for any exams when he was studying music at the University in Adelaide. He didn't sit for many exams when he was with the School of Mines. When he learnt to fly, he said, well, I'm not worried about the paperwork, as long as I can fly an aeroplane, that's what counts. And so throughout, he relied on his skills and expertise rather than his qualifications. And Lincoln Ellsworth, another moneyed American, supplied money for expeditions for 4 years in a row, and of course that occupied his time throughout the mid-1930s. Took him up to 1939. His dream was to fly across the South Pole as he'd done in the Northern Hemisphere. The Australian government decided they had no money. What's changed? They couldn't help. And so the project didn't come to fruition, but he carried out exploration, but didn't achieve the transit of the pole. For $1, he bought a submarine. His idea was to navigate underneath the ice of the North Pole. He had some ideas of drilling a hole in the ice and popping up at the top. But the submarine really was only worth $1. It was rusted, there were all sorts of problems with it, and he was lucky to survive. They actually got caught underneath ice as they were experimenting with it. But at the end of that, he wrote another book. And that's the Nautilus, stranded in the ice. Note that the submarine was called the Nautilus. And so he and his wife, Lady Wilkins, were invited to fly on the inaugural flight from USA to Germany in the Hindenburg. And so this they did, and she made a name for herself by entertaining the passengers on board. There was quite a number of them, and her singing, which she was good at, was transmitted by radio for the first time and broadcast over North America, a first for her. Russia had a pilot who was a bit like Wiley Post and other pioneer aviators. He decided that he'd fly across the North Pole and took off from Moscow and was never heard of. They heard from him when he had engine problems, went down, and they've never found him. In fact, if you Google that there, you'll find that people are still looking for the aircraft. They've got expeditions out there up until now. At the outbreak of World War II, both the British and Australian governments rejected Wilkins. They said, no, you're too old, we don't need you. So he became involved in a fact-finding mission for the US, Middle East, Southeast Asia, and the Aleutian Islands. You can imagine why he was engaged for that. Consultant geographer to the US Army with advice on equipment, rations for cold conditions. Just the man. He was given an honorary degree at the University of Alaska. You also find that he's recognised at many US universities. Not so much recognised in Australia, but certainly overseas people still remember him. USS Nautilus was a submarine with the same name as his rusted wreck. At the age of 70, he learned that the USS Nautilus and the Skate transited underneath the North Pole. And so it was special importance to him that that had taken place, because he'd thought about it many years before. But Wilkinson died in Massachusetts in 1958. He always regarded himself as an Australian, but lived overseas for the majority of the remainder of his life. And 4 months after he passed away, his ashes were spread near the North Pole. The USS Skate surfaced through the ice near the North Pole, and with appropriate music and the crew on deck, not shown in that photograph, his ashes were scattered. A great tribute to a great Australian. Thank you.